From the outside, China appears to have one of the strongest militaries, with the world's largest navy, a huge nuclear arsenal, a new fifth-generation fighter jet, and literally millions of troops. It all paints the picture of a military force that should be able to stand toe-to-toe with any other country on the planet. So then why did the only battle they've fought in the last 2 decades end up being such a complete humiliation for China? Is the Chinese military incompetent? Or is there something else going on that led to them failing so spectacularly when they were deployed to South Sudan in 2015? First, let's get a sense of the sheer scale of China's military. According to Global Firepower, which produces annual rankings of 145 nations and their military power based on size, equipment volume, and even geography, China has the world's third strongest military. It falls just below Russia and the United States, and only by a short distance, achieving a power index score of 0.0706.
The statistics make for impressive reading too. China's military has 2.035 million active personnel, with a further 510,000 reserves and 625 serving in paramilitary groups. The latter aren't under the direct command of the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, but they'll often act in China's interests should a conflict break out. In terms of air power, China has 3,034 aircraft, of which 2,478 are in a state of combat readiness, placing its air force third in the world in terms of sheer size. Its stock of fighters is actually second in the world, with 1,207 available to Beijing, and it's constantly building its stockpiles to get into top position. China's land forces are no less powerful. It has 174,300 military vehicles, the second most in the world, and around 5,000 tanks. It also leads the way in multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS, with a stockpile of 3,180. Moving the focus to the ocean, China has 730 total assets, including 61 submarines, 72 corvettes, and 49 destroyers. It also has a massive fleet of patrol vessels, 150 in total, that are responsible for defending the country's coast and alerting Beijing to potential attacks. This is all impressive, with China having built such a powerful military on the back of a modernization program that has cost hundreds of billions of dollars. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, China will likely spend $304 billion on defense in 2024, having spent about $280 billion the year prior. We can expect to see its impressive numbers grow in the coming years. So the numbers create the image of a country capable of taking on anybody. But it wasn't always like this for China. In fact, it's only in fairly recent history that the PLA has evolved to become the massive force that it is today. The country began a defined campaign to modernize its military starting in the late 1990s, which has seen it increase defense spending enormously. For instance, the period between 2000 and 2016 saw China's military budget rocket by about 10% per year. And although that growth has since slowed, falling between 5% and 7% in more recent years, it's spending that's indicative of a country that wants to develop an all-powerful fighting force. If you look back at China's history, it's easy to see why. It all comes down to something that historians dub the Century of Humiliation. Between 1839 and 1949, the Sinocentric order that China had established throughout East Asia began to disintegrate. European powers began to encroach on China's territory, slowly but surely dismantling the country's empire until it was a shadow of its former self. The Century of Humiliation began with the Opium Wars, which saw Britain attack China in response to China opposing Britain's decision to sell opium in the country to balance a trade deficit. The war raged for 19 years, with China being soundly defeated and large portions of its territory falling into European hands. Still licking its wounds in 1860, in the immediate aftermath of the Opium Wars, China went on to lose many of its tributary states to invading forces. France took Cambodia in 1863, with Japan taking the Ryukyu Islands 16 years later. In 1882, China lost control of Vietnam, again to the French, with the loss of Laos occurring to the same country in 1893. China lost Burma to the British in 1885 between those two losses, and the humiliations kept on coming. China lost 2 more tributary states, Taiwan and Korea, to Japan between 1895 and 1896, with 1911 bringing the loss of Tibet, followed by Mongolia in 1912. Finally, Manchuria was taken by Japan in 1931, with Japan also going on to devastate China itself during World War II.
Given the complexity of this, it's important to know the context around how the news is being presented to you. And that's why I'm working with Ground News again for this video. Take a look at this story I found on China urging the US to reflect on its nuclear arms policy. Ground News found 40 articles covering this, coming from sources around the world, like the governments of Russia and China, two of the countries the US is considering deploying more nuclear weapons to deter. Since it shows you news from sources that come from around the entire world, you end up with a different perspective you might never have considered. I appreciate that they provide these visual breakdowns of a source's political bias, how credible their reporting is, and even who funds them, so we can see how each of these factors influence their reporting. Here at the Infographics Show, we genuinely love Ground News and use the app and website all the time while researching to make sure that our sources are as factual and unbiased as possible, or that we're at least aware of what biases might exist. Ground News even goes out of their way to show what's being underreported in the media on any given topic with their blind spot feature, like China, Russia, or even Taiwan. I encourage you to go check it out at ground.news/info. You can subscribe for 40% off the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access. Subscribing not only gives you access to all the world's news in one place, it also supports my work. Thank you, Ground News.
All of this historical context is important to know for one reason. It influences the quest for status that China has embarked upon ever since the rise of Mao Zedong following the Century of Humiliation. During Mao's era, the quest was symbolized by transforming China into a communist nation that supported other countries, particularly in Africa, as they attempted to fight against the yoke of colonialism. Moving closer to the modern day, communism shifted to economic development, with China developing a form of cultural nationalism, fueled by pride in the country's economy, that lent the country an important place in the geopolitical landscape. That economic rise also fed into the military modernization we've seen over the last 3 decades, with that strengthening military also playing a role in China's desire for status. All of this brings us to 2015 and the proof that for all of its spending, China has a military that could be described by many as incompetent. In 2015, Xi Jinping stood in front of the world's leaders at the United Nations or the UN General Assembly to make an announcement. He was willing to offer 8,000 troops to reinforce the UN's various peacekeeping missions. As of 2020, Xi had failed to meet that pledge, with China having 2,534 troops deployed, which is 500 fewer than it had when Xi made his offer. Still, 2,534 is an impressive number, especially when compared with the 29 soldiers the US had in 2020, with Beijing also being one of the biggest financial benefactors of the UN's peacekeeping missions. In 2020 alone, it contributed $6 billion to the cause, covering 15% of the UN's costs in the process. These generous offers are not based on pure benevolence. As with the military modernization intended to overcome the specter of the Century of Humiliation, China's work with the UN is all about how the rest of the world perceives the nation. Brookings argues that committing troops to peacekeeping efforts offers great publicity to Beijing. Its commitments reinforce Xi's claims that China wishes to help create a multilateral world. In doing so, China subtly positions itself as a positive force in many countries, particularly those in Africa, that require aid. Of course, there's more to it than that. Brookings also argues that each UN deployment provides Chinese troops with an opportunity to gain experience in the field, experience which they can then take back to China to further strengthen its military. And it certainly doesn't hurt that China can also be able to gather some on-the-ground military intelligence about other nations while engaging in its UN peacekeeping missions. Still, it's mostly about image, with China wanting to project a picture of the country both as a respectable military force and a benevolent peacekeeper that uses its powers for the good of the world. Which brings us to South Sudan, the site of China's latest military humiliation. On December 3, 2015, China announced that it would be deploying a 700-strong troop battalion to South Sudan to support UN peacekeeping efforts in the country. The move marked the first time that China had actively committed combat troops to the UN, with all previous commitments being more generally related to security. And according to West Point, the Chinese Blue Helmets, a term given to UN peacekeeping forces, would primarily be stationed near several gas pipelines and oil deposits in South Sudan. Everything was going to plan. China could reinforce its image as a peacekeeper to the rest of the world, while also keeping its soldiers in strategic locations where they could keep an eye on Beijing's overseas investments. And for a few months at least, the plan was working. Chinese troops supporting the UN worked within a war-torn country without incident. But China had completely underestimated the situation.
South Sudan had been embroiled in civil war since December 2013, stemming from a power struggle between the country's president Salva Kiir and his former vice president Riek Machar. Despite a ceasefire signed in August 2015, violence reignited again in July 2016, and fighting broke out in the capital city Juba. And Chinese troops, alongside other UN forces, found themselves caught in the crossfire as intense clashes unfolded near their base, including strikes on nearby protection of civilians or POC sites. These POC sites were designated areas within UN bases meant to shelter civilians, particularly those from the newer ethnic group, who were especially vulnerable due to their perceived alignment with Machar's forces.
By this point, you may be asking yourself what this has to do with China. While its troops were deployed at UN bases in Juba, it had yet to engage directly in any of the fighting. However, it would be the day after July 10th that they would have their chance to display heroism and, in the process, demonstrate that the Chinese army has troops that the rest of the world should respect. They didn't take that chance. On July 11th, panic reigned in the POCs. These once safe shelters for civilian refugees had become hellscapes, with many civilians opting to flee in an attempt to make it to what they believed would be safe zones in the city. Many were from the newer ethnic group, which the Centers for Civilian Conflict suggests feared the possibility of ethnic cleansing should the SPLA win. 2 UN bases in Juba became sites that civilians started to believe would be safe, leading to many attempting to flee to them. Their efforts were made more difficult by the SPLA soldiers who blocked and specifically targeted those attempting to flee, particularly near the unmissed Tongping. However, it was the previously mentioned POC-1 site that started to see the worst of the violence. This was the very site that Chinese troops were charged with protecting. Having already experienced the ravages of crossfire and even a shell exploding near the site's perimeter fence, the Chinese UN troops were naturally terrified. When fighting intensified further, China's peacekeepers began to withdraw. Those stationed in POC-1's guard towers, admittedly fairly rickety wooden structures designed to more oversee the POC than fend off attacks, abandoned their posts due to a lack of protection from gunfire. Many escaped to ditches and the vehicles below the guard tower. Beyond the shell that exploded near the POC-1's perimeter fence, another explosion, this time caused by an RPG, occurred near a Chinese armored personnel carrier, or an APC. 6 Chinese peacekeepers were wounded in the explosion. POC-1 adjoined the UN house, yet the facility wasn't equipped with a blood bank or a surgical team to aid the ailing Chinese troops. The nearest hospital was a little over 9 miles away on the Tongping base. Unfortunately for UNMISS, the SPLA blockades that were preventing civilians from escaping to that base also stopped China's troops from escaping to it. 2 of the country's peacekeepers died as a result of their wounds from the RPG explosion, being left to bleed out with no substantial medical care for 16 hours. These casualties caused chaos within the Chinese ranks. The Centers for Civilian Conflict reports that POC-1 was left practically unprotected as China started to withdraw. The Chinese peacekeepers left the pedestrian gate completely unguarded, meaning SPLA soldiers could have simply walked into the camp if they wished, and on the morning of July 11th, all Chinese posts were completely abandoned. The country's peacekeeping troops fled to the UN house, many leaving behind weapons and ammunition in their wake. Some fell into the hands of the internally displaced, or IDP, youngsters who were still inside the POC-1. POC-1 became a war zone on July 11th. With nowhere left to shelter and no protection from the Chinese peacekeepers who had abandoned their posts, civilians in the camp attempted to flee to the UN house. Many were forced to climb over the chain-link fences surrounding the house, while others negotiated deadly barbed wire to find some semblance of shelter. UNMISS forces managed the situation poorly. Rather than providing safe passage for the civilians, they focused on protecting themselves. They even went so far as to fire tear gas canisters on the beleaguered civilians attempting to get into the UN house, verified by 7 independent reports, with practically no warning. The situation was equally dire in other areas. Over in the terrain compound, also in Juba, around 100 SPLA soldiers overran the facility and began a campaign of physical assaults. At least 5 aid workers were violated in horrific ways, with the violence culminating in the execution of a South Sudanese journalist of newer ethnicity. Once UNMISS received information about the attack, it gave orders to a Quick Reaction Force, or QRF, to travel to terrain to restore order. That QRF would have included Chinese and Ethiopian battalions who, due to sheer numbers alone, should have been able to restore order in terrain and save those being assaulted. but no QRF ever left the UN house. The Chinese peacekeepers refused to go. Even once UNMISS had successfully negotiated safe passage to terrain, working alongside the SPLA soldiers guarding the roads, China's troops still refused to leave the relative safety of the UN house. The abandonment of their POC-1 posts also resulted in more assaults within the camp, with one report claiming that a woman was even kidnapped right next to a position that was supposed to be manned by Chinese peacekeepers. The entire crisis was an unmitigated disaster for both the UN and China, which had utterly failed in its mission to protect civilians from the violence that erupted. Finally, some semblance of respite came toward the end of July 11th, when the SPLA and SPLM called a ceasefire. Over 4 days of violence, around 300 South Sudanese civilians, many of newer descent, were killed, along with many more being injured, sexually assaulted, or displaced from the POCs by the violence. Some were even struck with tear gas by the very UN peacekeepers charged with protecting them. As for China, it now had an example of what its troops could do to show the world. But it's an example it would never want to showcase. Media reports in the immediate aftermath of the violence focused on the Chinese soldiers abandoning their posts. They weren't the only ones. Ethiopian peacekeepers had likewise escaped to the relative safety of the UN house, though according to The Guardian, reports from South Sudan suggested that they at least helped evacuate civilian casualties as they escaped. Some even returned gunfire with fire of their own. China's peacekeepers, by all reports, failed to do even that. They had been humiliated, and to make matters worse for Beijing, some reports suggested that it ultimately was the Indian army that saved the day, at least for the Chinese peacekeepers. India Today reports that Indian peacekeepers who were stationed in reserve at the UN house were ultimately tasked with managing the constant flow of IDPs from the devastated POCs, and oversaw the evacuation of UN staff in the wake of the violence. It's not outside of the realms of possibility that India, which has its own border conflicts with China over the line of actual control that separates the two countries, was responsible for saving the Chinese peacekeepers. Beijing was humiliated. In response to the reports and overwhelming eyewitness evidence that those reports contained of Chinese post abandonment, China's defense ministry issued a flat denial of the reports of its troops' roles in the events of South Sudan. It said that all claims of abandoning posts were little more than malicious speculation, stating that Chinese peacekeepers merely carried out the orders given to them by UNMISS. Yang Yujun, a spokesperson for the country's defense ministry, even went so far as to claim that Chinese troops played a key role. Chinese peacekeeping officers and soldiers remained at their posts, quickly organizing reinforcements and continuing to implement the mandate of UNMISS while rescuing wounded soldiers, he said. Yang went on to claim that the UN was making unwarranted accusations about the performance of Chinese peacekeepers before an official report had been published, an action he defined as irresponsible. The official reports came later, along with many eyewitness accounts, and contradict Yang's claims. The incident in South Sudan marks the only time since China began its vast military modernization program that its forces have actually been tested in the field. By all reports, it failed that test spectacularly. Not only did its troops prove ineffective while stationed at their posts, but the country's UN peacekeepers actively fled, leaving civilians in harm's way in the process. For all of its efforts to avoid the humiliations that scarred China for 100 years through its military expansion, Beijing could do nothing to prevent getting egg on its face in the wake of what happened in South Sudan. The years following the 2016 incident have seen even more investment into the Chinese military, and yet even more rhetoric from Beijing about the power of its fighting forces. But questions now remain. If Chinese troops fled during a UN peacekeeping mission involving relatively untrained opponents, how would they fare should China itself find itself fighting a war against a powerful military nation? We'll leave the answer to that question up to you. Comment below and tell us how you feel the failed South Sudan mission reflects on China's military.